these cars started going by all the time. What we started to figure out was that there were these like stick-up crews, and they were looking at our lights and our cameras and all this stuff. And they would just go by and case us, right? And this wasn't the first time. We were the only thing shooting in, I think probably the only thing shooting in Philly this summer. So everyone kind of knew about this little film. I think I ended up calling 911 more times in that night than I've called them ever in my life, like collectively. Like I think I called them 6 times.
Welcome to The Practical Filmmaker, an educational podcast brought to you by the Filmmaker Institute and Sunscreen Film Festival, where industry professionals talk nuts and bolts and the steps they took to find their success today. On today's show, indie film producer Geoff Quan talks about the indie space as a director of production management for the original indie film team at Netflix. Find the full transcripts and more at thepracticalfilmmaker.com. I'm your host, Tanya Musgrave, and today we have indie producer Geoff Quan, a director of production management for the original indie film team at Netflix, whose works include Casey Affleck's Light of My Life, 6 Balloons, Blindspotting, which premiered at Sundance in 2018, and Netflix biopic drama Barry. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Tanya. Thanks for having me.
Geoff, you've got 8 features under your belt now. I want to take you back, fresh out of film school, or even what got you into film school. How did you get where you are today?
So you did mention I went to film school. I was at Columbia. I got my MFA there. Started production in New York, in sort of the New York indie film scene, kind of bopping around, taking a lot of production survival jobs. But so I was sort of doing this thing at the time where I would take like production gigs on like bigger things, PAing, coordinating. But at the same time, I was trying to get my experience as a producer, as a sort of a capital P creative producer. And so to start off with, I took a couple of tiny micro budget features, and those were the first things that I made as a producer. I mean, yeah, there were 2 of them where it was like $100,000 in the can, like just absolutely tiny, like the sort of thing where you benefit from not knowing what you don't know.
Yeah.
It was the kind of thing where, I was my own location manager, and I was my own accountant, and I was my own first AD, just stuff where you didn't have it. And it kind of like only later, as I got into my career, I was like, oh, right, there's a person for that, or there's even a department for that thing.
Yeah.
But from there, what ended up happening, because I had to do all of those things, I was working on these tiny features that were incredibly under-resourced. And so having to kind of pick up all of these practical skills along the way to make those things happen, I started getting approached to be a production manager or line producer on these other movies. So I was like, oh, you have these very sort of practical pieces. Mm-hmm. And that led me to other movies where I was learning as a production manager in this sort of idea of having a skill set where I could learn a lot, take on bigger projects that have presented bigger challenges, where the problems themselves were not just a function of that we had absolutely no money, right? Because not that that's not challenging, but at a certain point that became sort of variations on a theme almost, where it's like, okay, you just have no money, so how do you solve this? Or you have to like beg, borrow, and steal for whatever, so how do you solve this? It's okay, with a little bit of money, which means probably, a bigger sort of creative palette, like you're telling different types of stories that have different types of requirements. How do you then solve that stuff? Mm-hmm. That led me down the path of production management, line producing, and eventually getting back to producing. So it was kind of like this full circle sort of thing.
Yeah. Why have you gravitated towards producing and not, another role? Did you always gravitate towards producing?
I did, and it was an interest, I think, really in process and in team building. I liked understanding how to make something that was really complex and complicated, and with a lot of moving parts. And had this real interest in, when you put teams of people together, what is that alchemy that happens when you have an incredible team, right?
Yeah,
and that sometimes it's a little bit of magic and a little bit of luck and circumstances, but you also have to work really hard at it, because great teams don't just happen. I had come from a completely different field prior to film, so I was working in design, and sort of got this interest there, right? Because I was working with large design teams.
Okay.
It was sort of the wrong format for me, like the wrong medium in terms of the actual work.
Yeah.
But knew enough about myself and what I would really derive sort of satisfaction and pleasure from in that, to say, okay, well, if that's the wrong thing, but I like this process thing, that spoke to me as what I eventually learned was like, oh, that's producing.
You mentioned micro budget features, and now you've kind of gotten up to features that can actually handle a crew and a cast. And
Sure.
I mean, you have top billed cast, and, fantastic talent there. As you grew as a producer, did you have to, for instance, did you have to be part of a union? Is it still all technically like indie? Like, Are you part of the union?
So I'm part of the Directors Guild. So
Okay.
within the Directors Guild, obviously there is the director,
Yeah.
but it's also what's called the Directors Team,
Uh-huh.
which consists of a unit production manager, first AD, second AD, second, and
Yeah.
depending on a couple of other positions, depending on where you are.
Mm-hmm.
I got in as a UPM on a movie called Ride, which was directed by Helen Hunt. It was a
Oh, okay.
surfing movie that we shot in LA. Once you get beyond a certain point, most movies tend to be in the guild, and so it was a way for me to
Mm-hmm.
continue to grow and participate in bigger, more complex movies and
Yeah.
stories.
A huge bit of filmmaking that always seems to be a mystery is distribution.
Sure.
I would love to know about your first film that you sold.
I mean, so the two micro budget films we did sell sort of in bits and pieces. It was also
Bits and pieces. You got your expound on that.
those things. They were really little, made with virtually no stars. A first time director. So there wasn't a
Mhm.
lot in there to say we're going to pitch this and somehow it's going to the pitch was not like, hey, great commercial success, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
to say that
Yeah.
that these films represented authentic experiences that if you could connect them to the right audience, there were going to be people interested in them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And often what that meant for us was that we were having to go and say, we're going to go to particular platforms and sell off particular pieces of rights for that stuff, whether it's by territory or say, this is all going to Amazon Prime as an example, or not Apple TV, but sort of the previous version when it was all through iTunes, right?
Mm-hmm.
That sort of stuff. So it was that's what I mean by bits and pieces, where it wasn't the sort of thing
Okay.
where we were not getting a studio payday where somebody's like, I'm going to take all rights in all territories in perpetuity throughout the known universe. Like we were not so lucky in that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think much more typical of the stories you don't often hear was that, we had to go do that gradually over time and sort of try to build out a distribution plan with the idea of saying, that there's value in the story, but how do we convince people to come find it out? And part of it was, I think, also has been in the last 10 years, there's really been this glut of content. So in some ways, like, how do you even just find the audience, right? Because it's all there and there's seemingly ever increasing numbers of titles and content to find. But how do you then cut through and be like, how does an audience member find you, right? And then how do you convince them to be like, I'm going to rent that or I'm going to buy it?
So, I mean, you mentioned in the last 10 years, there's been like a whole slew of changes within the industry. What did you learn in that space? Like, for instance, like the first film that you sold versus the first film that you sold maybe to a streaming platform, or was the first one already on a streaming platform?
They were already on streaming platforms when we sold them. The difference is partly is the model now in some ways, right? If you look at where most viewers are now, they're in these sort of subscription-based models, whether it's Netflix or you're on HBO Max or Apple TV or one of those, right? Where it's like the transaction is a time-based one. I have a monthly subscription that renews, versus a single transaction, more akin to a movie ticket, right? Which was what sort of the old digital model was. It's like, I'm going to rent this movie, but instead of getting a video cassette or a DVD, it comes to me as a digital file that I have to watch in the next 48 hours. That sort of things. And I think with that, there, certainly, so much about the ecosystem has grown in its sophistication of how, what's on those platforms, how it's merchandised to you. The experience of watching those things in that environment. That's all radically changed in the last 10 years.
You had mentioned before that Six Balloons was one of the first wave, like as in before we were chatting before we actually started recording, but the Six Balloons, secrets. Well, I'm about to like tell the secret, I guess, but like, it's not really a secret. No. Six Balloons was one of the first, you said, cash flow films of Netflix's indie department. It was how you came to Netflix.
I was working as an independent producer and line producer for 10 years. And this is sort of from the end of film school to where, when I started at Netflix, and I've been here for about 4 years. As part of that, I ended up making 2 films for the team that I now work for. One of them is Six Balloons, which you mentioned. And at the time, Netflix, before they're now known for all of their original content, but there was a time period in which the idea of being in a digital space, a streaming space, was really new, and so they were looking to build a catalog. So they would license and acquire titles. And at a certain point, they flipped that, or started to experiment with, well, what would it be like if we made our own? And so Six Balloons was one of this first wave of independent features that Netflix cash flowed and produced, and so I was hired in to help make that film for them.
Knowing what you do now, like even as a filmmaker, how does all of your experience inform what you look for in projects for you as a filmmaker?
part of what I had always set out to do, and I feel very fortunate to have done, whether it's the films that I've produced or the things I've gotten to help make while at Netflix, is just the variety and diversity of that. I, as a filmmaker, as a producer of color, I feel like, there's a responsibility there to be telling stories that reflect what our world looks like. And I think, fair to say that for a long time in at least American cinema, that's not always been the case. And part of what I've loved about being a producer is that there have been incredible, authentic, original stories that if I was in a different role, I would not be the right voice to tell that story. But I see the role as a producer is sometimes to be the facilitator and to say that I can do that. And so I think one of the things that I look at with that is that when I look at material, it's always about the authenticity of the voice, the authenticity of the story. And oftentimes it's led me to be able to participate in really incredible projects where we may not have seen that before, but if I can bring my sort of skill set to that, then that feels like that's my contribution. So something like Blindspotting is a good example of this.
Yeah. One of the things that I have always kind of been curious about whenever I talk to somebody, and this is it's a hard industry, there's always a why. Like, why is it? Like, what is your passion about? Like, specifically, what is it that keeps you in this particular industry? And I've always wondered, like, hey, what is it? Is it inclusion of voices, that kind of thing, the passion? So maybe that's my next question. What is your why?
I think certainly it's part of it is what we already talked about a little bit is that inclusion, is that sort of diversity is. I remember watching things growing up where like having very specific moments of seeing what I felt like was a reflection of the life I knew and the family I had and the culture I come from on screen, because it didn't happen that often.
Right.
I think that's certainly part of it. Yeah, I'm sure.
I get that.
I think that's been part of it. I think also partly I like the puzzle, right? Like I think as a producer, there is the puzzle of having to go out and figure out something that's ambitious and challenging and just being like, oh, I haven't done that before. And I want to do something I haven't done before and be challenged in that way. Let me go figure that out. Which I think is like both like the really rewarding part, and sometimes it can also be the incredibly daunting part of it too.
Yeah, the learning process, there's a lot that goes wrong. That's how we actually learn. So
I think honestly that those are the best lessons, right? Because those are the ones you never forget. You do it wrong once, you're like, oh, I'm not doing it that way ever again. It was too painful or too expensive or both.
Well, all right. So tell me some things about what went wrong. What lessons have you learned the hard way?
Oh man, I mean, that's a good. It's like where to begin?
Which breath of air?
I think one of the things that I've learned and been reminded of over and over again is there's the challenge of how you pick a project, right? Which we've talked about a little bit sometimes. Yeah. So many factors that can go into that decision, whether it's economics, like, hey, this helps me pay my rent or helps me save towards my next project or whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
There's this idea of opportunity and where it might lead. There's, whether it's like networking into something or something you feel like has got potential, maybe you're learning something, but there's lots of different factors in how you sort of like rank order that stuff. A good example is getting a project where like, hey, I could take a really big thing and be, somebody's assistant or a junior member of that team, or I could take a much smaller thing, but have a much more senior role. How do you stack those two things up against each other?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I kind of learned the hard way, I made the mistake of picking material over people. And it was this sort of thing where I picked a few projects early on in my career where the people that I was working with, we were not the right fit for each other. And that was as much on me as it was on them, right? We had different working styles. We had different communication styles. We had different conflict resolution styles, which is a huge part of filmmaking.
Oh my stars, yes.
Because I also think that when you make films, like, everyone can be polite and on their best behavior for a coffee or that first meet and greet. But when you make movies with each other, like you see each other more than you see your families, right? Like, and at some point that polite facade, it's too much work to keep it up all the time. And I think everyone sort of defaults to who they are in terms of like, this is how I deal with conflict.
Yeah.
This is what I'm like when I'm stressed or I'm tired or I'm hangry or whatever. And if you don't vibe with that other person that way, if you're not compatible, that's not a great fit, right?
Yeah.
I did the thing where I ignored some of that stuff and I was like, I love this material, or I love the idea of working with this person. The lesson there was like, the material on the projects will change. People, in my view at least, less so, right? And so it's like, you have to find the right people, because this stuff is really hard. This stuff is really hard even when you're making it with people that you love and trust, right? Like,
yes.
you take that away and it gets infinitely more challenging.
How about a specific story when something went wrong, either as a producer, because I helped produce a micro budget feature this summer, and on my stars, you want to talk about the things that went wrong? I mean, your job as producer is to deal with the stuff that goes wrong. So, I mean, yes, there is a lot, but if there's a particularly juicy story of something that went wrong to make every listener feel better about their life.
Okay, so I will tell a story from one of those micro budget features.
Okay.
So
Right.
one of the very first features I made was this micro budget feature set in the punk rock scene in Philadelphia. And I don't, prior to this, I knew nothing about the punk rock scene of Philadelphia, but sort of like thrash underground bands hosting like parties in the basements of row houses, kind of stuff. And for $100,000, as you can imagine, we made it for no money. I slept in the house that was the main set, like on an inflatable mattress that deflated every night, and would like go to sleep above the ground and wake up on a thin layer of rubber that was on the ground. It's every night, kind of thing. I mean, it was a really tough physical shoot, myself included in this, like a barely professional crew, kind of non-professional actors, just understaffed and underrun. And we were in Philly at the time, and some of the places we were, which was supposed to be really authentic, was not the safest place. So we were shooting in some tougher neighborhoods. Yeah. And on the last night of the shoot, we ended up at a home base in a warehouse conversion. It was sort of anomalous, a soundstage, but really was just a big converted warehouse.
Yeah.
And shooting overnight. Our little crew was made up mostly of like crew that was just a year out of undergrad kind of thing. Some of them were still in college. We had a couple of interns that were just out of high school kind of thing, like incredibly young, no security, which is where I'm going with the story. But we're outside shooting one of our only night scenes. These cars started going by all the time. And what we started to figure out was that there were these like stick-up crews, and they were looking at our lights and our cameras and all this stuff. And they would just go by and case us, right? And this wasn't the first time. We were the only thing shooting in, I think probably the only thing shooting in Philly this summer. So everyone kind of knew about this little film. I think I ended up calling 911 more times in that night than I've called them ever in my life, like collectively. Like I think I called them 6 times.
What?
They kept coming for us, and we didn't know. And look, it sounds horrible. Like we felt like we were, we kept trying to. It was our last night. We had to finish the movie, kind of thing.
Oh my gosh!
But it got to the point where, like, at some point, we found ourselves on the roof of the soundstage, the quote soundstage.
Yeah. Peering
over the roof, watching like the minivans with the 15-year-olds, kids that had guns and were going to take what they wanted from us.
Oh my gosh! Yeah. Oh my stars. And then you just didn't go to sleep. There's no point for the mattress anymore because you just
look, we at some point we stopped and waited for the sun to come up, and had to wait for the sun to come up before we could walk out of the building. It's not dark out. It's, everyone else has gone to bed. We are safe. We can leave.
Oh my word. No, I wouldn't have slept. My adrenaline would be going so much. No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Oh my word. So you had mentioned that, it was a pretty young crew, non-actors. That actually kind of leads into one of the listener questions from our Instagram at Practical Filmmaker. I'd like to hear lessons you learned at the pivot point between working with non-actors and then big name actors for top billed cast.
That's a really good one. I mean, because I've even had projects in the middle between that, where I had a couple of projects where we cast a mix. Uh-huh. I made a movie with a director named Justin Tipping. It was called Kicks. It was about sort of being sneakerheads in school, and it was a mix of non-professional actors and professional actors. It was sort of intentional. We were shooting up in the Bay Area, which is where I grew up. I wanted to really represent, in some ways, give back to the neighborhoods in which we were shooting a little bit, and that was connecting with the community and providing some opportunities, and and that there were these sort of vibrant artistic communities there, kind of in these neighborhoods that had a lot of challenges. And so we paired everyone up. So part of the cast was professional, part of the cast was non-professional, and the challenge there obviously was to know sort of where and how to kind of arrange them and coordinate them, knowing that like those actors were coming out with drastically different styles and drastically different training, but how do you make that then feel cohesive? And it's not like, oh, this is the scene where I'm watching a non-actor versus now I'm watching a real actor, and have it jar people.
Yeah.
So we had to do a lot of like sort of how do you connect them and make it feel organic. For the non-actors, it was like how do you make sure that they're doing something within their range, knowing that they don't have necessarily have the training, but they have something that raw kind of like authentic thing. And on the flip side was taking professional actors and inserting them into this and also saying, okay, well, we don't want to call you out either because you feel like you're not real to this world.
Yeah. Maybe like non-SAG actors, like the actors that, I mean, they might be professional actors, but like for instance, those who are producing for an extreme micro budget feature that, they're not going to have anybody you've actually heard of,
Right.
versus landing an actor that people have heard of. I think they're talking about that pivot point.
In some ways, it's having those actors of note. I think that what you're talking about, it opens a lot of doors, and there's such opportunity that can come with that because it pulls attention and spotlight and focus to a film. Not only when the film is done, but frankly when the film is being made. Right, like in some ways, having those people on, it gives it kind of this like stamp of approval, right? Where it's like, oh, if so and so thinks it's good enough that they're going to participate in this, then that something's like, oh well, that I describe it as that thing of like, no one wants to be the first one in the pool, right? So suddenly you get a big name in there and everyone's like, oh, well, they're doing it. I'm going to jump in too because I like this thing, or I think it's, I'm not worried that there's going to be something weird. The flip side of that sometimes is that there is a lot of opportunity cost. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but just in terms of like, for those that are looking and at that point where they're making that transition is it's more like you just have to be ready for it to know, because suddenly to have those professional actors means in some ways you really are running a professional set. And so all of those other pieces that come with it, the support teams, the crew to make that happen, the cost obviously that comes with those teams and with the perks that often big actors need to do their work. So it's deceptive in that sometimes you're like, oh man, I got this person, I've made it, or I've done this thing. It's a little bit, can be like the tip of the iceberg, if that makes sense.
Say filmmakers have this thing now. They need to get people to see this thing. Like, I've got this film. What's your best advice for filmmakers and where to position themselves? Like, one of the things that a previous guest had mentioned, and when he was dealing with all of his distribution stuff, he was just like, sometimes it's a really flawed model to make the thing first, take the thing to festivals, and hope that you'll get distribution from those festivals.
It's incredibly flawed.
Yes. Why? Why is it flawed, and what do they do differently then?
It's, if you think about it just from like the statistical, like an odds standpoint, right? Like you got to make the thing, as you said, which is hard enough. Like making the thing to me is like you have to get all of these miracles to line up at the same time, right? You have the actors that get you your equity, you have the equity that gets you your actors, and you've got get your locations and your permits and your on and on and on. And it's all, and it can't, those things can't happen like, oh, the first one happened in January and the next one happened in March and maybe the next one in August, right? They all have to happen at the exact same time for you to do anything with it, right? So that's the first set.
Yeah.
And then you do that, and then you have to get into those festivals where you actually, at least in US cinema and American cinema, you can actually go sell the thing, right?
Yeah.
Which is, it's on a huge list, right? Like you're talking, you're talking Sundance, obviously, you're talking South by. There's not a lot of that stuff that happens in that way. So so then you have to like, great. So first you got to make it, then you got to like win the lotto to get into the festival where you could sell it, and then you got to win the lotto again because you sold it, right? So it's like this, it's like hitting like concentric bullseyes.
Yes.
In a windstorm, standing like
in different galaxies.
Right, exactly. A couple galaxies away, right? So it's just really hard to do, and it's not a sustainable business model, right? Like in a way that you can say, for filmmakers to have a sustainable career, you have to sort of say, I look what I do with my first one because it helps me get to my next one. And so if you're saying, okay, if I'm making my first project and the only way I get to my second one is to sell the first one at a festival that I was lucky enough to get into, that I was lucky enough to get a distributor for, that somehow makes my investors whole. It's chancy.
What is the correct way to go? I mean, because like I think I had talked to, he was a sales agent, and it was the first sales agent that I'd ever talked to in my life, because I was just like, oh, I don't know how any of this works, because what you learn in film school is how to make the thing,
Yeah, totally.
So you're just like, this is I have it, right? Now what?
I'm done. I've won.
Yay! So I've got that lottery, and we've got it. We got it in luck. What would be your advice though for people to like, for where to go after that? So like particular resources that you know of that like, oh hey, these people, like there are certain roles that actually specifically will help you with this? Like, I don't even know what those roles would be.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think you already mentioned one that, having a sales agent, even just thinking of like of the life cycle of a film, right? And all the people that touch it at various points in its life.
Mm-hmm.
Like a sales agent is at a very particular point in its life in terms of like it's been made. It now needs to get to audiences vis-a-vis a distributor.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that there are experts that is their expertise and practice and passions, that they do that piece of it. So
they do that piece.
I've been in the case, and I know most filmmakers have been in that place where suddenly you find yourself at that moment and there's so much information and there's a lot of fear and trepidation about like, you're supposed to do this, you're not supposed to do that. It's like, the worry is that, those people obviously have to make money. The sales agents and those businesses, they're businesses. They they need to make their own money.
Yeah.
And so sometimes there's I'm not going to spend that. There's a reason you do, and there's a reason they charge you for those things.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of it, is to actually have those folks. Another piece of that too is also to have a publicist. Right. And again, it depends on what you're after and where you are. But again, going back to the comment of like, how to just create awareness around your title, that it exists, let alone that, it's interesting and here's what it's about and here's why you might want to go see it. Right.
Yeah.
Again, there's experts, that is their core practice. If you ask a filmmaker what their film is about, and why they want to make it, that's not necessarily the same answer as what the publicists will say. This is why it will appeal to people, right?
Okay.
I made a movie several years ago called Obvious Child. It's a romantic comedy, and there's an abortion in it. Like that's the main crux. The Jenny Slate, who's the star, she breaks up with her boyfriend, loses her job, and gets pregnant, and then is contemplating an abortion. Right, and it's a romantic comedy based around those set of circumstances.
Yeah.
And when we were making the movie, it's interesting just to watch how we had to change how we talked about it. When we were making the movie, we were so concerned that, again, not a lot of resources. We were asking for a lot of favors and help and for people to chip in what they could. And there was a worry that if it became sort of too hot button or was perceived to be too hot button, people would pull away. We didn't talk about abortion at all. Cut to A24 buys it out of Sundance. On the one sheet, it's like a romantic comedy about abortion. Like that was the pitch, right? Like it was a complete 180. So there was this idea of like, functionally, what do we need to talk about? But A24 and obviously that team, and saying, okay, well, we're the people selling the movie now. This is how we're going to talk about it. So it's just that thing of like, there can be, in that case, it's very specific in terms of our concern, but it can also be really hard when you live and breathe a film for years to then be like, what do I have and how do I talk about it in a way that everyone else is going to be able to approach it, right? Because there's that moment too where a film, if it does the thing you want it to do, it's not yours anymore. It sort of leaves you and like it becomes everyone else's. So they have to be able to enter it on their own. And so like having that publicist to say, well, here are the points of entry.
Yeah. Okay. About that publicist, the filmmaker that I just interviewed, he worked with a publicist for the first time ever. What do you look for in a good publicist, and where do you find them? Because is it like you just like Google, hey, publicist, but is it a specific, because they're entertainment lawyers, right? There are lawyers specifically for this business, right? But
sure.
like obviously,
no, there are specifically film publicists too, in that same way that they're all publicists, but there's some that do the specific thing. Yeah. You want to find somebody who's actually really genuinely interested in your film, right? Because if their job is to like essentially kind of go out and pitch your film and sell your film, you just do better when you have people that actually like what they're talking about, right? That goes for when you make films too. Like ideally, some people do it for the paycheck. I get that, but if you have people that are really passionate about what you're doing, I think that shows up in the work. And you don't always get it, but I think like if you can, it's a nice to have, certainly. Yeah. Knowing the space where that your film might fit in. So one of the micro budget features that I made when I was first starting, a Korean American story. The writer director was Korean American and his entire cast was. And so we needed somebody who knew sort of that Korean American, sort of Asian American publication space, right? Like there were certainly incredible publicists who were really good at what they did, but that they lacked that specific knowledge that was about the film and where that might find audiences, readers who are going to be interested in being, I heard about this cool title. Sometimes it can be specific.
What are some red flags that you would look for
Oh, that's a good question.
Or even just like if I could break down weaknesses of artists, I mean,
Sure.
it would be a lot.
Oh,
It'd be
this
a
will be
lot.
interesting. Let's go.
No. But it's like it's basically everything that I feel like producers are good at. You know what I mean? Like breaking down the black and white, defining the bottom line, and defining what that is. But also, like the black and white when you actually have to come to sign it. I mean, a lot of artists are just like, sure, I'll sign this. They have no idea what they just signed.
Sure.
We talked a little bit about distribution and all that fun stuff, but publicists, that's a new kind of area and vein that, I want to say, I guess seems like almost a luxury at the micro budget level. Like to deal with the publicist, they're just like, oh, we don't have budget for that. We have enough budget to get this thing made. So
Totally.
you got that, yeah.
It's been a while since I've signed a publicist contract, so I'm trying to think back a little bit. But I think part of it too is really to define what the goals are, right? Of that sort of, in that can be broken into like how many placements, if that makes sense. Like what are the goal? Where are you seeking to place the story, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Is it going to be the New York Times and
Variety,
or like is it trades? Is it there's a whole thing about trades like Variety, Hollywood Reporter, Deadline. Is it sort of general interest kind of reading like something like the New York Times?
Mm-hmm.
Social media is another one that can also be a specialty too, right? So I think it's a little bit of like being able to talk with people, get their assessment of your project, and then where they think the audience might be, and going from there. But then I think also then defining the scope of that. The idea is that if you could sign somebody up to do this, but unless they're actually putting it out into the world, it's not, you can pay for something that you're not really getting.
How much of the budget should you reserve for that process?
I'm of the opinion, and I think you probably get a lot of different answers on this. I don't think you reserve anything, at least in the making of it. Right?
Really?
I don't think so.
Really? Nothing for distribution and publicists?
Well,
then what do you do? How do you what do you do after that?
Because it's built on this idea that what you're looking to do is make the best film you can, right? Like put what you have into the movie.
Oh. Okay.
So if you think about it a different way, and this is something that comes up all the time right now with COVID, right? Is that, I've had lots of conversations with filmmakers and producers, how much of my budget should I save for COVID? And there's like, well, how do you know? Like in some places, like, well, you don't, right? The idea is like, you're trying to, especially if you're looking to be able to then make a sale, like you want to give yourself the best shot is to make the best movie possible, right? The other stuff, not to say that you won't have to pay for a publicist or you won't have to pay to figure out, have people to help you distribute the movie.
Yeah.
But in some ways, like, it doesn't matter if the movie itself isn't good. The better your film is, the more opportunities will be open.
Put all of your resources into like what's actually shown on screen, and then you'll be
right. Like if I'm having to make a trade-off to say, oh, I need to protect for a publicist, but it means I can't have something that will add value and scope to my movie.
It means that I can't have this actor.
I can't have this actor, or I have to lose a day of shooting. That's not equivalent, but you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Choose the thing that makes your movie bigger and better. You deal with the other part later. You'll have to, but if you don't have a movie that people don't want to be involved with because it's not what you hoped it to be,
up to par.
Then you're sort of stuck.
No, that makes a lot of sense. What gear or gadget is an old reliable for you, or resource? Something that you keep on going back to?
I mean, resource, I use IMDb Pro every day, all day. I'm sure that's probably been talked about a lot, but in terms of having sort of like the encyclopedia of the industry, in terms of reference, in terms of being able to figure out who people are and where they're coming from, their experience, it's to me is like an invaluable tool.
Yeah.
I think going along with that, the resources, frankly, like the biggest resources is my network, right? And that sounds silly, but the idea of like, filmmaking, there's so much to know. So having other people that whose opinions you trust and that sort of thing you can go to, whether it's like, hey, you've worked with this person, or you know how to connect me to the person that knows this person or that thing, or just like, hey, I need that gut check, or like I'm gonna bounce this off you. Like it's not terribly cutting edge or cool, like in a way, like it's super old fashioned, right? In that way, like, but it's that thing of like, it's all people when it comes down to this.
100%. And probably one of the more unique answers that I've had to this. The network, that is not something that anybody has ever answered before. It's awesome.
the thing I have from having made all these movies is I have all those people that I've worked with, and you find the people, there are people that I call and I'm still in touch with from those movies, that I've made years ago, because we have become a resource for each other.
Absolutely. For the revolutionizing how you work, then, is that also, I mean, no, I'm going to ask for your resource. Now your favorite new school, how you revolutionize your work, the newest resources.
So many of the tools I have that enable remote work now. I think there were versions of this stuff more than 2 years ago, but really has come into the fore now. So like, remote watching feeds from set, remote dailies, this kind of stuff that I feel like has allowed the level of sort of collaboration where we previously were like, I don't know, I have to get into the room and do it with you in person. And there's a lot of that now that I think it really has only, they're tools of necessity. It has allowed us to continue to make movies since March of 2020.
Yeah.
But that's all stuff that's kind of been figured out on the fly.
So wrapping up, what questions should I have asked you?
Where is indie film going next, right? Like, I think that's such an interesting question, of which I don't know the answer to.
Oh, come on.
There's been such momentous change, right? When you have, just in terms of like going back to what you were first asking about with the distribution places, like all of these places, there are a whole lot of places that didn't exist as places for distribution even a few years ago, right? The place I work for, a lot of the other streaming services now that, a lot of them are attached to legacy studios, but that model of saying, I'm going to give, I can push something out and it goes everywhere in the world to anybody who's got a subscription, that's relatively new. It's kind of deceptive because it's so ubiquitous, right? But like, what is that doing for distribution, not at the indie level? What is that doing at distribution at sort of further on when you're more into the studio side? All of that stuff creates interesting ideas about sort of upstream or downstream opportunity. Like, that the ecosystem is all affected by itself. The marketplace has really changed. Just even like, Sundance having to be virtual. If you listened to Sundance talk about that, where they're like, hey, like, we've had more people subscribe and be able to attend, quote unquote, attend Sundance in the last 2 years virtually than we've ever had come in the door in Park City, right? And what does that do in terms of like the democratization of audiences and consumption, right? You don't have to be able to like pay to get on the plane to get to a condo in Park City and like that whole thing, right? Like, so I think it's this really interesting moment of transition.
Besides all of these different streaming platforms, you have new opportunities even in social media too, because I get the Quibi didn't go very far. But I remember seeing trailers and what have you on TikTok, and I'm just like, man, when is it going to be that like there's going to be a Netflix sponsored series that is totally shot for TikTok or something? Because they used to do that for some things like on Instagram, and you had WB had done this web series, and like they're trying all this short form content, and kind of wondering where it was going to go. But yeah, with Quibi, I mean, like that, I was thinking like, oh yeah, that's what's going to take off right there.
Right. Who knew? One thing that's interesting though is that with the old styles of how content, as we'll call it, like was shown, you had to fit really prescriptive formats, right? You were a 120-minute feature, you were a 60-minute dramatic episode, or a 30-minute sitcom episode, right?
Yeah.
And if you weren't those things, if that wasn't your story, you were kind of stuck.
Yeah.
Right. Or even within that, right? Like if you were going to be on TV, well, you better have 22 episodes or 24 episodes or whatever the network standard was to say you had a season of something, right? And now it's like, okay, I've got my series is 6 episodes, or my series is 8 episodes, or or like if you even watch the stuff that's on streaming now, where it's like, okay, but this episode is 53 minutes and the next episode is an hour and 5 minutes, right? Like there's so much more flexibility to be like, okay, what is your story and what does it actually need?
And I feel like that's actually kind of freeing for an artist to be like, we're not constrained by 30-minute or 50-minute or, what have you. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. Thanks so much for sharing your insight. We really appreciate it.
Totally, of course. My pleasure.
If you enjoyed this interview, follow us right here and on Instagram. Ask us questions and check out more episodes at thepracticalfilmmaker.com. Be well and God bless. We'll see you next time on The Practical Filmmaker.